I wrote this book, Prince George and Master Frederick, because I wanted to find out whether a story that my grandmother had told me when I was a child was really true. She had always said, well, you know, we are connected to King George III. He had a son, wrong side of the blanket, who lived in the house where I grew up. And there was a portrait of him on the wall. His name was Frederick Blomberg. And it was only a fragment of information, but it stuck with me all these years. And then I thought, well, I think I'm going to investigate. Sure enough, Frederick Blomberg had lived at Kirby Misperton Hall, the house where my grandmother grew up. And then my interest was really piqued when I came upon a ghost story. And this was relating to Frederick as a small child, when his father, whose name was Major William Blomberg, who'd been out in the Caribbean and he'd been killed. And on the night that he died, he had apparently appeared to his commanding officers saying, when you return to England, go and seek out the child of my secret marriage. And once you've located him, go and tell the king, George III. And these soldiers duly did do this. On hearing about this child, who was then a 4-year-old orphan, the king, George III, by now married to Queen Charlotte, and they had 2 children and another on the way, decided to adopt this child. So little Frederick, at not quite 4 years old, was bundled into a carriage and taken away by the deputy governess to the royal children and brought up at the palace in Richmond. He probably fessed up to Queen Charlotte and said, yes, it was before we were married, before I even knew I was going to be king. And yes, there was a child, and my best friend married Frederick's mother to get her out of trouble. King George and Queen Charlotte, to my mind, were very generous in that they adopted this child. They took him on without ever meeting him before. They had no idea who he was going to be. And he became a playmate to the then 3-year-old Prince George, heir to the throne, Prince of Wales, who was to become a lifelong friend of Frederick. George, obviously heir to the throne, living in some splendour, being this much lauded child, in the palace at Richmond where the royal family lived. And this was where Frederick was brought. It's hard to imagine, really, someone being wrenched from the rural home where he had been living in modest circumstances, and suddenly is brought up as a prince. To begin with, Frederick and George and the other young princes were educated in the nursery at Richmond Lodge, which sounds like quite a gentle and pleasant place, which was run by Lady Charlotte Finch and her deputy, Henrietta Coatsworth. And when they were at Richmond, I think life was pleasant and it was gentle and it was full of children. And then, as the nursery swelled with all the many children that the royal couple kept producing, the older boys, so this was Prince George, Prince Frederick, Prince William, Prince Edward and Frederick Blomberg, were all shipped over to Kew Palace to be tutored by serious tutors, and life changed enormously. These tutors were Tartars in the sense that they would not tolerate misbehaviour. Beatings were regular. And for little Frederick, whose role was not quite that of prince, he was the extra child, he really took on the role of whipping boy. So that when George, who by all accounts was quite a naughty boy who didn't really take to education very much, if he made a mistake and there had to be a thrashing, it was Frederick who got the beating. He never acknowledged Frederick publicly as his son, but the king paid for Frederick at the age of 16 to go to Cambridge to study divinity, and he was then ordained. And his very first living, which is the parishes that you're given, was in Shepton Mallet. There he was, a young clergyman of 23. It did raise a few eyebrows in clerical circles that this young man was given such a very lucrative living to start off with. And he was later also granted the living at Bradford-on-Avon and Banwell. But at the same time, he was also appointed chaplain at Windsor Castle. George, the Prince of Wales, the future Prince Regent, he was just a big personality. He wanted everything. He was greedy. He was self-serving. He was selfish. He indulged in anything that he could get hold of, whether it was food, drink, women, gambling, you name it. And by contrast, Frederick seems a much more circumspect, modest sort of person, and also by dint of having been educated, sent to university, becoming a clergyman, was a much more rounded person, probably better able to just cope with life. However, these two remained close friends from childhood right the way through to the end of their life, but they were particularly bonded by music. They were both consummate musicians, but Frederick particularly became very, very good at violin and cello. Later on, as vicar in his parishes, he became renowned, not for his preaching from the pulpit, which by all accounts was not impressive, but if he took out his fiddle and he played, people would flock from miles around to swell the congregation and to hear him play. They were following very different paths, and yet it's clear that they stayed in touch a lot, and that Frederick was frequently summoned by George to come and help get him out of various scrapes. And he did get into scrapes, my goodness me. Probably the most significant thing that Prince George did was to make an illegal marriage to a twice-widowed woman called Mrs. Maria Fitzherbert, whom he absolutely adored, and all credit to him for that. But a Catholic woman, far older than him, twice widowed, was not the sort of woman that the royal family would approve of. It was never a proper marriage. It was basically a sham. But she demanded it, and he loved her. He was desperate to be with her. So he defied his father and went through the whole process and married her. And in my book, I suggest that Frederick had some involvement in this, but not directly. But he might have just procured the vicars, the priests who actually conducted the marriage at Park Street in Mayfair.